Okay, hello everybody and welcome along to our public meeting about the future of the Phoenix Park. So we're going to get straight into it here and start introducing ourselves and the subject of the meeting. So my name is Ciarán. I'm the communications coordinator for Dublin Cycling Campaign, and I'm just going to go across the grid I see on screen and introduce the various panelists that we have tonight. So we have Kevin Baker, who's the chairperson of Dublin Cycling Campaign. We have Cian, McKenna, who's representing the Streets Are for People movement. We have Mary Caulfield, who's also a Dublin Cycling Campaign member and an advocate for disability and accessibility. We have Cat O'Driscoll, who is a councillor for the Social Democrats in Dublin North Central, I think. Colm Byrne, who is also a councillor for, no, have I that right, Colm? Am I that wrong? Sorry. Michael Pidgeon, councillor with Dublin City Council. Kieran Perry, councillor Dublin City Council. Norah Casey, businesswoman, broadcaster, and former Dragon's Den. Marie Sherlock, Senator Marie Sherlock from the Labour Party. Mike Banim, who's representing the Leafybatter group from Stoneybatter. Feljin Jose, who is representing the Dublin Commuter Coalition. Ciarán Cuffe, who is the MEP for Dublin. Darcy Lonergan, who is a Green Party councillor. Pamela Conroy, a Green Party councillor for Fingal. Neasa Hourigan, Green Party TD for Dublin, Dublin Central, Dublin North Central. Ken Foxe, who is a legal expert and a freedom of information expert. Louise Williams, who is the vice chairperson of Dublin Cycling Campaign and who is going to help me out here co-hosting the public meeting this evening. So I go back to Colm Byrne. Sorry, I got a bit afraid there. Colm Byrne is a consultant geriatrician in the Mater Hospital, and he's representing the Irish Doctors for the Environment. So sorry about that, Colm. So thanks everybody for attending as panelists, and thanks to our attendees who are watching in here from the outside. We're going to begin the discussion just to talk for a few minutes about the Phoenix Park as it was and the experience of the Phoenix Park during the lockdown. So just to share my screen for a second here. So the broad question we're going to discuss is, was the Phoenix Park a more pleasant place during the lockdown? And if so, was the reduction in motor traffic the main reason for this? So I'm just going to come to one of our panelists here, Norah Casey, to maybe chat briefly about this. Norah, you have some first-hand experience of the Phoenix Park and life inside it, both before, during and after the lockdown. So maybe if you could chat for a couple of minutes about that and your experiences of it, please.
Thank you very much, Ciarán. Delighted to talk about the Phoenix Park. I'm definitely, it's, well, one of its most vocal ambassadors, I think. My family have lived in the Phoenix Park for generations. My grandfather first, he minded the graves in Arbor Hill, actually, for the Easter Rising heroes, and he eventually was given the lodge at the North Circular Road, and he was quite a debilitated man. He lost the sight in one eye from being interred in Frongach and in Northern Ireland and in the Curragh. So he brought up his family there, one of whom was my father. And when he died young, my father took over there as, I think in the early days, constable. They were called constables. They wore something like a Garda uniform. They minded the gates. Then they became rangers. And in my lifetime, there were 8 of us in that 3-bed lodge in the North Circular Road. I went to Stoneybatter, to St. Joseph's, and in our local community, firstly, the homes in the Phoenix Park, the 15 or 16 families that lived there were very close. I went to school with most of the kids who grew up in the lodges there, knew all of them by first name terms. We were always dropping into each other. But also outside the gates, of course, we had neighbours in Cabra and the Navan Road, and more so Stoneybatter, O'Devney Gardens, and they all used the Phoenix Park. The lockdown reminded me so much of my childhood. My father would open the door and we'd all run wild. And there isn't one part of the park I don't know, because we all had bikes. My father rode a bike and he was posted to, we thought, the other end of the earth, you know, Knockmaroon Gate and to White's Gate and down to Farmley. And so we just explored every single section of it. In those days, of course, traffic wasn't a big thing in the park. It certainly was something where people were out picnicking, using the facility. They used public transport. The number 10 and 14 bus in Infirmary Road got bucket loads of people coming on a Saturday and a Sunday. Over time, it may not have affected everybody, but certainly us and our family. Things like concerts in the park became a huge issue for us. The noise pollution, the impact it had on the deer, on the biodiversity. My father, there isn't one thing about the park I don't know anything about, because my father drummed it into us. First thing you see inside our lodge is a big map of the Phoenix Park, and he would proudly boast about it being one of the second largest inner city parks in the world and the largest in Europe, and the fallow deer, and the fact that 50% of the mammals in Ireland are in the Phoenix Park. Something like 40% of the bird life is in the Phoenix Park. I think what people don't understand is that because the park is so laid out to sports grounds, as it should be, there's very little of it, you know, the wetlands, and there's very little of the 15 acres that's actually trampable. And I tramp it all day, every single day. So the pathways and the roads are very important for people for access. I was main carer to my mom during the lockdown, so I was there all day, every day. And in the early days, when nobody was really allowed to go in there, it was really eerie walking around it with the dog, the family dog, and not meeting another human being. But the great thing was the silence of the park. You know, there's nothing quite like that silence where you can hear the birds singing, where the deers, they were roaming everywhere. They felt very free to come out close to the main road. There was nobody around. They were free in their own habitat. There's I think, of course, I'm a cyclist, but a very bad one. And most of the skin on my knees is on the tarmac in the Phoenix Park, and still is regularly. So, but I still love it. But I also love walking. And the one great thing about the lockdown, so many times, like all of us would stand in amazement and see little kids out there cycling with their parents, people picnicking, all sorts of different people from all sorts of different backgrounds, the great cultural diversity of Dublin celebrating the park in a way it should have been celebrated. The animals felt comfortable. I've never seen such life within, like, the gardeners in the Phoenix Park, firstly, are amazing. Pat and Byrne and people who do great jobs in the visitor centre and in the people's gardens, in those very, I guess what you'd call them, very planned gardens and very beautiful gardens. But really the beauty of the Phoenix Park is in the wilderness and the biodiversity, where you get into the wildlife and you're truly tramping through this amazing plant life, species that don't exist anywhere else. And then as the gates started to open up, you know, Chesterfield Avenue started to get busier and people were allowed to go further and further afield. It was even more magical, I would have to say. It was fantastic to go out there on a summer's evening. I tended to see my mum first thing in the morning, in the evening time, to see people truly enjoying the best of what a green space is. Solace, people doing yoga, people meditating, people playing football, people doing exercise. I personally saw no issues around social distancing. It's a huge, big place, but it became part and parcel of people's daily life, the way I saw it when I was a child growing up, that I haven't seen since. The big car park that became Dublin Zoo, even the Garda Síochána struggled with car parking. So right down where our gate lodge is in the North Circular Road, there's cars parked, double parked, all over the place. All of that had stopped. The one thing I'd say is, you know, the Phoenix Park is this wonderful, beautiful place. I always say it's a way of, you know, leaving the city without leaving the city. But what is really the point of having the Phoenix Park if it's clogged with traffic? Because it actually undoes all of the great things that an inner city park should be doing. I was in London for 20 years of my life. You can't park at London Zoo. You know, you have to park way outside Regent's Park to get into it. You know, even in New York, Central Park, they've closed whole sections of it to traffic, and that's right bang in the middle of Manhattan. If there's an argument about traffic throughput, then surely they have a very strong one. The good thing about, the terrible thing about them, sorry, opening the side gates, is that they gave nobody any warning, including my mother. None of the people who live in the Phoenix Park got warning. I went up there the night before. I was up with her till about 7 or 8 o'clock at night. The gates were closed. The next morning I arrived, the gates were open. There was no warning. They just opened up. There was no letter through the door, no notification, nothing. They were just suddenly opened up. Even though they're trying to control a certain number of the car parks in the Phoenix Park, and I'm sure all of you know this, if you're there all day, every day, you know that those car parks get clogged very early. There are people back parking on the curbs. There's, fine, Chesterfield Avenue is grand, but if you look at North Road, if you look at Glen, you look at Whites Road and places like that, they're all clogged. There is absolutely, within 5 days of those gates being opened, I was out on my bicycle with my niece, and there were cars honking their horn behind us, totally intolerant of the fact that we were on the road as well as them and trying to drive around us. So the only thing I'd say for me, the Phoenix Park is everything to me, not just for cycling. There's a lot of elderly residents. My mother worked in the Cheshire Home in the Phoenix Park. We have loads and loads of friends who are in St. Mary's because they have lots of the local community there. Lots of them sadly passed away during COVID. So it's a recreational facility for people who are otherwise lonely and isolated. So as a community space, it's tremendously important to people in and around the environment, and I believe very important to the whole city of Dublin. That's my tuppence worth.
Thanks very much for that. That's an incredible and valuable insight into life in the park. So thanks a million for that, Norah. And I suspect that most of our panelists would agree wholeheartedly with almost everything that you've said there. If anyone doesn't, please speak up. No shame in it. But if we're nearly all agreed that the Phoenix Park was a more pleasant place during the lockdown, regardless of the national, international disaster which created that situation. But we might maybe, do we have a consensus that it was a more pleasant place and that it was the reduction in motor traffic was the main factor which created that environment in the park? Is that more or less a consensus that we have here? I see a lot of nodding heads, so we'll take it that we have a group consensus on that. A lot of you are public representatives, and I presume you received a lot of representations about the Phoenix Park over the course of lockdown and in the last couple of months. I want to maybe talk particularly to Councillor Michael Pidgeon, because you created a petition in relation to this, Michael. So you might just give us a little insight into what spurred that petition and what came up from it, please.
Yeah, thanks, Ciarán. Yes, so all of us in the Green Group on the City Council, we put together the petition. It was just my name in it because I did it at the time. We put together the petition for kind of the reasons that Norah and yourself have set out, that the park was just a nicer place and we wanted to keep it that way. The petition spoke specifically about ending through traffic, but that's kind of one of the things that could have been done in practice. That maybe the side gates or certain other arrangements could be that. We're not necessarily wedded to that, but it was just trying to keep the kind of intangible benefits of what the park was like in that period. 7,500 people signed. I'd say the majority of those were within 24 hours. And out of that, crucially, we got about 1,500 people who are willing to receive emails about the campaign. So we presented the 7,500 to the OPW. It was received. The comment we got back was from the OPW. This was before they got their new minister, which was very much on the basis of, yeah, we agree. It's been great. And if you look at the press releases on the OPW website, you can see that the switch. From where they were clearly quite positive about it. I do think, to be fair, there were problems with access to the park and in some of the streets around the park that do need to be resolved and can't totally be dismissed. There were issues, but I guess the aim would have been to change them, to fix those issues rather than just reopen the whole thing. The last thing just to say quickly is that just kind of, I know Ken is going to go into it, but just a bit of the process ahead, because we used the emails, the 1,500 people who received emails, we got them to email the minister as well. I know he got like 400 or 500 emails off the back of that campaign alone, and I'm sure many hundreds others from people who just like the park. Part of that process is now led to some sort of process. I'm not sure if it quite be public consultation, but it'll involve the OPW, Dublin City Council, Fingal County Council, and then the Department of Transport in some form. Whether that's the MTA or the department itself is a little uncertain. And I know I've spoken to management in OPW and City Council, and soon will, Department of Transport. That process has begun in the sense that they've started reaching out to people and discussing when they can start discussing it and that sort of thing. But the idea there was essentially once the gates were closed, obviously a lot of us in the Greens are very annoyed about that. So the key demand, which I think we got, was that it would be something that would be relatively rapid. So we wouldn't be having some sort of 10-year review of where we all wonder what the nature of a park is and, wither grass or whatever. Like the idea was just that we would just come up with a relatively quick thing. So I think when people are talking about this, I think it's useful. The final thing I'll say, I think it's useful to sketch out what are some very, very short-term measures you'd like to see that could be done as quickly as the gates were opened, as quickly as closing them, whether that's simply placing a planter here, a planter there, closing certain gates, leaving other ones open. And then there's also longer term stuff, like do you want buses going through the park? Do we want through traffic? Are the side gates a more important goal than the through traffic? That's all up for discussion, I guess. But I'm hopeful we'll have some progress in the next month or so on this.
Thanks very much, Michael. Just before we go on to Ken Foxe, are there any of the other local representatives here who want to make any particular points about the nature of the representations that they received about the Phoenix Park, let's say during lockdown or just before the gates reopened, or were they all of a similar nature to what Michael Pidgeon has been talking about there? Was it broadly supportive? So Ciarán Perry there, go ahead.
Thanks, Ciarán. Anything to do with the environment or cycling in general, there's a very, very well organised lobby who tend to inundate people's inboxes with requests for support and all that. So I found, particularly locally, there's another issue. There's another area of, say, this dispute where there's quite a split between those who want the cycling and those who don't, in the example being Grange Gorman. And one fear I would have is that we don't become an echo chamber, just speaking to ourselves and fully agreeing with what each other are saying. There's very little I can disagree with what Norah has says. I walk my dogs up the park almost every night. I've lived beside the park for most of my life. It's an absolute fabulous facility. And the scariest thing that happened pre-lockdown was the attempt at commercialisation, the OPW, with the park that I know the other public reps would have been involved in. So there is a concern there that the OPW may not be singing off the same hymn sheet as the rest of us. That must be borne in mind. As a public rep, I've also found the OPW relatively difficult to deal with over the years. I think I'm a councillor now over 10 years. I found them relatively difficult to deal with, even as an elected rep. That's one thing to be aware of. The other thing is the genuine concern of people in the locality in regards to both the parking when the gates were locked. The parking was absolutely disgraceful. Now, again, as we all know, Ireland doesn't do enforcement very well. And the answer really to that is that there's enforcement if there is illegal parking. In a lot of the cases, unfortunately, the parking wasn't illegal. It was parking on roads, but it ended up blocking roads, blocking estates, etc. Another concern that the locals do have is the traffic, that if the traffic is stopped going through the park, where that traffic will actually go, and will it fill up all the surrounding roads, which already have traffic issues. So I think if we're serious about bringing on board those of us who don't necessarily agree with us, that we'll have to get our ducks in a row, be able to take on board them concerns and argue. I think Michael has a suggestion there whereby we look at what is achievable in the short term and maybe in the immediate term and possibly the longer term then. And I have had some people looking for onto ban cars completely from the park. I don't personally think that's practical at this stage. I think that would do a campaign for a more sustainable park more damage than it would, because we're going, in my opinion, we'd be defending the indefensible at this stage. So just to note that the vast majority of emails I would have had would have been supporting what we're trying to achieve here. But there's a very, I'll use the word silent for want of a better word, maybe electronically silent alternative view, and I think we must be very, very wary of that. In a lot of the bike lanes, environmental improvements, the issue of disability is consistently raised, and again, legitimate concerns about those who are disabled or those senior cits, and how they would actually get to, get to where, say, the park in this instance, and how they can still manage to enjoy the facility if there is no cars allowed. Like, obviously, I think one of the previous speakers, or the pre-meeting, they were talking about increased public transport like that. I think that's all a must if we're to convince the disability sector and senior cits that we're not looking to exclude them in terms of what we're proposing here. Good.
Thanks very much for that, Ciarán. Neasa, Hourigan, you had your hand up there if you want to go ahead.
Yeah, actually, to be honest with you, Ciarán covered a lot of what I was going to say, because I agree with a lot of what he said there. The vast majority of the very, very many emails that I got were very unhappy that the gates were opened, both in the actual fact of it. So everybody got used to a good thing and they don't want to lose it, and they realized all of a sudden how incredible the park can be, but also just the way it was done. That, what Norah was saying there is that it was done overnight, and as we've seen from the brilliant work Ken has done, that this was basically kind of a deal made behind. This is somebody getting on to someone else, and there was no public consultation about it, there was no notification, it was done overnight in a kind of a fairly questionable way. So there's a lot of emails around that. Obviously, I and Ciarán and a few others have had dealings with the OPW over the visitors' experience in the last year or two, and have a bit of experience of dealing with them. I do think that, like, my experience, and obviously I have a child with a disability, and so I think that what would help, because I think that's a really key thing that people have brought up, and one of the things that I found with the visitors experience issue is to narrow down what it is exactly the objections are, or your options are. And I think what I realized from the experience, and having because we live in a tiny 2 up 2 down with no garden and no backyard with my 3 kids, and they're all really small, and so during the pandemic the Phoenix Park became our only breakout time and our only breath of fresh air, and it was incredibly important, and there'd be a lot of inner city families like that. But they all have their own challenges, and so I think for me, what I've come to the conclusion of is that you can see from the minister's announcements and from my own emails to the department are 2 things. One, this is not based on traffic numbers, because we've asked them for the traffic numbers and they haven't given me the traffic numbers from the time that we're talking about, with a comparative analysis from other weeks and other months. So this wasn't some kind of very carefully judged piece of research and a decision made. This was a decision cooked up. And so first of all, this is not about traffic numbers, because they can't back that up. I think that's something to bear in mind. And then the second part of it is that the minister is saying that he refers to commuting, that it's a commuter route, right? And I think, speaking as someone who, I have a car, I'm also, like Norah, a really, really terrible cyclist, and I'm an anomaly in the Green Party as a really bad cyclist and not a confident one. And I usually have a child who obviously can't cycle with me. And so, having an option of getting to the car, or to getting in a car and going to a park, I think that is important for families with disability. But I think what we're talking about here is that characterization of what should be a park as a commuter highway, and to me that's a really key thing, and that's a justification that's being referred to over and over and over again, and that's less about, as Michael said, as Councillor Pidgeon said, that's less about what specific gate we close, and it's more about a kind of a longer term view of, is this actually a commuter route, or is it a park? And I think it's those 2 things. A, that it's not, this doesn't seem to be a decision that's backed up by good traffic research, and B, what are we asking for here? And I think something around that commuter highway idea, is what we should be talking about.
Thanks, Neasa. I might come to you in a second, Marie Sherlock, if that's okay, but I just want to bring in Dr. Colm Byrne here for a minute from the Irish Doctors for the Environment, and just to talk, if you will, for a minute or two, Colm, about the public health aspect or the general health aspect of the park and reductions in air pollution as a result of reducing motor traffic. And maybe if you just want to introduce Irish Doctors for the Environment as well, just for people who aren't familiar with the organisation.
Thanks, Ciarán. I suppose Irish Doctors for the Environment were a group of doctors who got started nearly, I think, about 2 years ago now, but that were, you know, doctors who were interested in environmental issues and the effects of environment on health. I suppose I come from a couple of directions to this. A research area of mine is air pollution and the effects of that on health. It's been shown to affect not just the lungs, as you would expect, you know, causing things like asthma and emphysema and things like that to be worse, but also heart disease, stroke, and even things like dementia, Parkinson's disease, and so on. And these are effects that are both short-term and long-term. So the short-term effects of COVID, you know, and the short-term effects of reducing cars in the park would have been pretty quick, and the effects would have been very quick in that reduction in air pollution, because, you know, green space is very good. You know, again, that's been shown to improve health benefits and so on. But that, you know, that needs to be traffic free. That needs to be air pollution free for it to be of benefit. Because if it isn't air pollution free and you're exercising in a polluted environment, that negates the benefits of the exercise you're doing. So it's important. You know, it is important from a health point of view that, or the areas where we are active are pollution, you know, as pollution free as they can be, as can be, and to have cars in the park certainly makes that worse. So I suppose just on some of the other comments there as well that have come through, I also work in St. Mary's Hospital in the park, and I suppose just to echo what has been said there as well, just that access to St. Mary's for people with disabilities and for older people as well is very important. And you know, as much as we'd like people to be active, you know, car access is still important, but certainly alternatives as well, like public transport, would definitely be of benefit.
Okay, thanks very much, Colm. Marie, I'll come to you quickly before we move on to Ken Foxe. You want to go ahead?
Thanks, Ciarán. You were asking about the opinion, and you know, that I suppose what communications, what representations we've received from the general public, and I suppose to echo what Ciarán and Neasa and indeed what Michael have said, but I suppose just to take a little bit further, that I think in some ways we have two very entrenched bodies of opinion now, or schools of thought out there with regards to future access in the Phoenix Park. And I think because of the shambles of agreeing to keep 6 of the 8 gates closed and then reversing that decision, you know, as Norah said, overnight, I think now we're in a very sad situation where you've got two very entrenched schools of opinion, and there's a very significant job of work to be done to try and build trust and paint a picture or paint a vision, and provide a vision to local communities, to interested users, to cyclists, to walkers, to those with mobility impairments, to older people and to families, about how the park can be for everybody. Because like I must say, I was quite shocked at some of the responses, people who, you know, traditionally would be very pro cycling but were absolutely horrified that their particular gate to the Phoenix Park was closed off, even though sometimes they were, you know, living very close to the Phoenix Park, but because they always were able to drive. And, you know, I suppose I should put my hand up here, like, as in I'm a cyclist, but I also drive with 3 small kids and a baby who I wouldn't put on a bike. She's only 10 months. So, and, you know, respect to anybody else who does put a baby on a bike, but you know, I chose to use the car. But I think in terms of trying to move ahead now, and actually I agree or come to a consensus about what we want from the park, I think is actually quite a difficult thing to do. But I think the other thing to say is that it's over 1,700 acres. There's no one size fits all in terms of the you know, what should be done with the park in terms of all the gates closed, or 6 of the gates closed, or 6 of the gates open, of the 8 gates open. And I think that's probably one of the big things for us as even in this discussion is to think imaginatively about what should happen, because maybe some of the gates can remain closed, some of the gates should be open. Again, we need to talk about zebra crossings for pedestrians. My colleague Councillor Declan Mina sends his apologies here this evening because he can't be here, but you know, he's visually impaired, and you know, he would make the point that that those with mobility impairments and cyclists need to work together, because often they're pitted against each other by an anti-cyclist lobby in particular. And I don't like talking about an anti-cyclist lobby, but we know that it is out there, and that those with disabilities can be, you know, an excuse at times to not progress cycling initiatives. But those with disabilities and cyclists need to work together to ensure that it's a safer environment for both cyclists and pedestrians, and that one isn't pitted against the other.
Thanks, Marie. Louise, did you want to go in there for a second?
No, I think Janet wanted to come in.
Sorry, I'm Louise, Ciarán. Sorry, my name's coming up as Louise. That was me asking to...
Sorry, Janet.
Louise forwarded me the link to the thing, so I think for some reason my name is now Louise. I'm Janet Horner, councillor with the Greens in the North Inner City, just to clarify, not Louise Williams. But my comment as Janet Horner is just a couple of points about North Inner City, which is the park is a huge amenity, obviously, for people in the North Inner City. And I think just a few in terms of, I think what Marie's been touching on, and just there of sort of building consensus and building a bit of understanding in what is like a little bit, unfortunately, becomes about seemingly about one interest group pitted against another interest group, and that we're not, and that they're kind of 2 competing interests. Just a couple of things I think are worth mentioning. I think for the North Inner City, one of the issues when the park was actually closed, the gates were closed, is that people drove to the North Circular Road, they drove to the area surrounding it, and they parked the cars on the footpath, and then they actually blocked the park. For a lot of people, particularly those who had buggies or wheelchairs or whatever, the park actually became blocked for people with disabilities in a new, different way than it normally is, because the footpaths surrounding the park were blocked, and that was a problem that was highlighted. So I think it's just worth bearing in mind that one of the issues I would be sensitive to in talking about how we deal with it and how we talk about the gates of the park is not to bring the problem of parking into the residents surrounding the area and those who need access. And I think just the other things, I think Dr. Colm Byrne was talking about there was just on air pollution. It's an issue that I have a really strong interest in the North Inner City, and I think we have one of the densest populated areas. We have some very high levels of air pollution. We've got the lowest tree coverage of any constituency, any local area in Ireland, and it's unsurprising that we're like the North Inner City is also one of the most disadvantaged communities in the country as well, and that those factors coalesce. So I think when we are talking about rights and access to the park, the idea of competing sort of commuter routes with actually a lung for the city and the health and the right of people to actually have an open space in the North Inner City, and that an open space that they actually do not otherwise have, and that is important because that does contrast with other parts of the country and other areas. And I think that, you know, we need to think about how we're weighing them, the right to say, like the right to kind of say I need this commuter access route versus the right, which I think is a much stronger one, to health, to quality of air, to quality of life. And I know there's other people here who've spoken to the issues of people with disabilities, but particularly the right to access those green spaces for the most vulnerable people is hugely important, and not to assume, as I think so often we do in those debates, that car access is actually synonymous with access to the park for people with disabilities. And certainly for those in the north inner city, it is actually becomes the impediment to that access. So I just wanted to put across those points from my own area.
Thanks, Janet. Councillor Darcy Lonergan is going to make a really quick comment now before we go on to
I will,
Ken
quick
Foxe.
one, promised. Janet kind of touched upon it anyway, but just, I don't think there is just two sides. I think there is a middle ground. I'm kind of the Cabot Glass Nevin area, and I got people who were very much, you know, just mad at, of course, that it was going on to the residential area. They didn't really mind about the cars, but it was a knock-on effect to the residential area, and they didn't mind either way if the gates were going to be open or closed, but just that people took that into account. I think also kind of what Janet said as well, a lot of people didn't mind it being opened again. It was the fact of the cars going through it. It was the fact that the cars were parking on sidewalks. So people who were walking, even without, you know, a pram or anything, just me and my friends, our own selves, you couldn't actually walk by because they were blocking it. I think that was a huge issue. And the other one is, if we are taking into account the park as a whole and how we all feel about it and how we want it to be there for a couple of more years and how we want to use it like this, we have to take into account that there is no lighting in the park, especially in the winter time. So either way, if we do all this, you can't walk in the park at night. And also the fact that the walking routes are further down where the grass is and the tree is, so they're actually a little bit dangerous as well. So I think we need to take that into account. And also, if we're being ambitious, we should maybe ask for more toilets as well, so people and families can actually enjoy the park, you know, for the whole day.
Okay, thanks, Darcy. I'm going to talk to Ken Foxe now in a sec. Just before I do that, I'm going to launch a poll here in the Zoom chat somewhere. So this poll is just being launched with a couple of questions that are related to the topics we're discussing. So you can vote away on that as we progress with the meeting, and we'll hopefully remember to come back and have a look at the results before we finish up. So I'm just going to talk to Ken Foxe now, who's, Ken, I guess you're an expert in freedom of information, and you operate the website RightToKnow.ie. Will you just introduce yourself and what you do, please? You're just on mute, sorry, Ken, if you just unmute there and start again, thanks.
I think it'd be fair to say that the records that I posted, they don't really explain the decision-making process, which is not particularly unusual, because a lot of the decision-making process, particularly when it comes to something like this, can be done in a verbal way. So what's left is kind of hints and scraps of paper. But what it does is make clear certain things that did and didn't happen, and it gives us a bit of a hint at the why. But I think the ultimate why is probably only known by the minister or the OPW commissioner, and probably some of the public representatives who lobby them. So from the records, we know that Jack Chambers and Emer Curry were involved in making representations on behalf of their constituents, but there were reps from Labour and the Green Party as well, and some of the people who've already spoken have explained what those issues were. And I think it's important also to say that Leo Varadkar is mentioned in several of the records, and he had clearly taken an interest in this. What is really apparent from the records is that the OPW at management level do not appear to have been fully on board with this. And I suppose that would have been obvious in the sense that they released their famous green long press release on July the 6th, and that was just 3 days before the U-turn and the reopening of the gates was announced. And I think that the level of support it had internally in the OPW was made really clear in a draft press statement that kind of got batted back and forth internally. So on the 10th of July, the OPW sent a first draft to the minister's office, and it was all written in the first person and said, I fully recognise, I concluded, and so on, and it was sent at about 4 o'clock. And then Minister O'Donovan's office, about 40 minutes later, sent back a second draft, making it seem more of a joint decision, and it turned into we concluded and our decision. And then 40 minutes later, a third version comes back from the OPW, and we concluded is replaced with Minister O'Donovan concluded, and our decision becomes this decision. So it seemed pretty clear to me that the OPW, certainly at the people who were involved in the original decision making around this, were certainly not endorsing it. And that was also illustrated in a text message exchange between a senior official in OPW and the minister's people, where he was warned it was likely to face opposition. And there were other text messages. There was another text message, then released where Minister O'Donovan himself, he said that the wave of negativity on Gates had started as expected. And in that message, he mentions the Taoiseach, Leo Varadkar, and local ministers being happy once there was going to be meaningful engagement. And it suggests, it's very much suggestive of a parallel process that was going on in the political sphere as opposed to within the OPW. And I think the only people who can answer for what really happened would be Minister O'Donovan. And I think the other thing as well that it's important to say is that the records show that on Garda Síochána, and in general, they have been relatively conservative when it comes to road traffic and so on. They were more than happy for this experiment to continue, at least until the end of August, and with kind of the promise of a review as to how things might go, I suppose, when the schools came back. And they were specifically saying that they weren't aware of much in the way of traffic problems. Dublin City Council had also indicated they were happy for the arrangements to continue. They said they'd received a few observations, but not too many. They said the traffic was heavier in some areas, but it was no evidence it had become extremely problematic. And as I said, I think it shows as much as anything that whatever lobbying and the real decision-making process that was involved in this was not necessarily going on within the OPW, and was something that Minister O'Donovan was personally involved in. And that's not at all unusual for a decision-making process to be poorly recorded like it is in this case.
Okay, thanks very much for that, Ken. That's a great insight into what's going on behind the scenes. Ciarán Cuffe, MEP, you wanted to make a comment there as well, and I'll come to you afterwards, Caterista, if that's okay.
Yeah, thanks. Ciarán, just wondering, could I share my screen briefly? I have just one slide.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. And if people can see, that is actually not what I was looking for. I'll just bring that. Yeah, there we go. This is just a diagram showing where the vehicular gates are in the park, and looking at the main traffic routes in yellow, the kind of the routes that don't have traffic on them in kind of blue or turquoise, and the couple of interventions that the OPW has put, the 3 dots there where through traffic isn't allowed through on that route, and down here at the bottom. Just to say, it is a little bit challenging as a problem. You have the big attractions like St. Mary's Hospital, the Garda headquarters, the zoo. Then you have the smaller ones, the American Ambassador, the cricket clubs, and so on and so forth. But you also have the houses, and I think there's somewhere between 15 and 30 individual houses within the park. So vehicular access is probably still needed to most of them. But I think there are solutions that can be done relatively quickly. My own experience, I grew up, you can see a kind of a little blue dot down there, or I've lived there for the last almost 20 years. And the park was extraordinary for my children to grow up in, first in the kind of playground down in the bottom right-hand corner, but then as they got older, exploring the rest of the park. And they've got to know this wonderful resource. And I think particularly during lockdown, it wasn't just the absence of traffic and pollution, it was also the absence of noise. And you could actually hear the bird song, you could hear nature in the park, and I think that's worth remembering. How do we go forward from this? Very simply, I think the OPW, they need to do a little bit of traffic modeling to see the impact that would have, because a lot of voices are saying that the outside roads would fill up with traffic, but you would get traffic evaporation. And you do have both the N3, the Navan Road to the north, and then the N4, the Chapel Izard bypass to the south. And it doesn't necessarily mean that, for instance, Chapel Izard Village would fill up with traffic. traffic modeling can show ways of dealing with all of that. So I think if we model the traffic, we can then start to look at solutions that would certainly take out a lot of the through traffic from Chesterfield Avenue. And look, I appreciate you still need access to the special school up here at the top of the park. You need access to the ordnance survey, but there's ways that traffic engineers can make this happen without allowing a free-for-all through the park. And one final thing I would just mention would be the idea of having a bus route from Castleknock through to the city. Bus routes are specifically banned in the Phoenix Park bylaws. They talk about charabancs and omnibuses, which shows you that the bylaws date from the 1920s. In fact, Ernest Bly seemed to sign off on them as a minister. So I think it's time we change the bylaws so that Dublin Bus could run a route through the park. And I think that would reduce some of the through traffic. So look, two things. One, I think we need to do some traffic modeling and do it quickly. I mean, as Neasa has been saying, we can't let this drag on for years. And secondly, let's bring in a bus route through the park from west to east. And I think that would really improve the access to the park for so many people. So that's it. Brilliant that there's so many people online interested in this. I think there's huge appetite for reducing the amount of traffic, and I think it should happen sooner rather than later. Thank you.
Okay, thanks for that, Ciarán. Councillor Carter Driscoll, you want to make a comment there as well?
Thank you, and thanks for putting the map up there, Ciarán. It really brings to life what we've been talking about. I would like to, well, first, a small comment. I get quite frustrated when discussion assumes that commuters all use cars. And so calling it a commuter route ignores the fact most of us walk or maybe cycle or take other means to work. So I think through traffic and the language that's been used here is much more useful when we talk about what needs to happen. I'd like to go back a few points about air quality. Like others, I'm really passionate about this. I've had lung issues all my life. And so I was cocooning during lockdown. I wasn't able to go to the really small part of the park that is within my 2 kilometre piece, but it just showed me that taking away vehicles really does purify the air in a very quick way. And it's something that I've recently been looking at in relation to clean air is speed limits. Cars going slower in lots of modelling has shown that they emit less, particularly diesel models. Less emissions come out, less of the harmful tiny particles come out of the car if it's driving at a slower limit. I didn't know that the speed limit in Phoenix Park was 50 kilometres along that main road, which we know in accidents causes more damage to everybody involved. So I think one of the first things that should be looked at in the short term is an immediate reduction of speed limits. If people are using the roads to get into the park, driving at 30 kilometres wouldn't actually impact their getting around in a massive way. And I'd also use this opportunity to highlight that Dublin City Council are doing a consultation about speed limits across the city, and it's closing later this week on the 13th. So it is something that I think people on this call and interested in how we get around the park are also interested in how we get around the city. I'd love to get people to respond to that. But yeah, I think there's lots of things that we have gathered from lockdown in that less cars moving makes things much safer, and that we need to enshrine some of those in our city as we move forward.
Thanks for that, Kat. So we're going to move on to the next part of the meeting, part 2, which is about what we want for the future of the Phoenix Park. Now, we've probably covered a few of these topics already in the discussion. So, you know, what does a sustainable future for the park look like? And one thing to maybe briefly discuss, and we probably have a consensus that's based on what people have been saying already, but, you know, if these are the 4 major uses of the park, you know, what is the hierarchy of these uses? I'm going to put it out there that based on what a lot of people have been saying, the top of the hierarchy would be that the park is a biosphere or natural habitat, followed by a public amenity, a public resource, a recreational area, and that after that it's somewhere between a transport corridor and a tourist destination. would I be correct in suggesting that, or does anyone object strongly to that hierarchy that I suggested there? Okay, I'll take that as given, and we'll just move on then to the next one to save a bit of time. So the next part is just in terms of transport, there is a kind of an international sustainable transport hierarchy, which is sort of accepted as what we should be endeavoring for in our cities. But I guess, especially our parks, it shouldn't really be up for discussion in our parks, but it is up for discussion. So this is the transport hierarchy as it's set out. And you know, at the top here, you obviously got walking is the top of the hierarchy, but within that, it's people with disabilities, it's people with mobility aids, people pushing buggies, all of those things. And we've discussed disability and access quite a bit here. And I want to bring in Mary Caulfield, who's a Dublin Cycling Campaign member, but she's also an advocate on disability and access, and just to share some of her experience of access to the Phoenix Park, and maybe even talk a little bit about cycling with a disability, Mary. And just unmute your microphone there, Mary, as well before you start, please.
There we go. Hi. Yeah, I'm a person with a disability, and I'm also a cyclist, but it's even more connected for me in that my bicycle, which is an e-bike, is actually my main method of movement. In particular, during lockdown, when I was no longer able to use public transport and having health issues and a disability, it became even more important for me to avoid public transport. So, you know, having access to my bicycle became more important. But that in turn, it makes having safe spaces for cycling even more important. I found it interesting that every speaker so far has mentioned people with disabilities, with the exception of Ken Foxe, who was commenting on the reason why the park was reopened to motor traffic. And so the people who made the decision makers, were the only people not speaking about people with disabilities. I think when we speak about people with disabilities, sometimes I get the feeling that people with disabilities are used as a bit of a shield, a bit of a veil for people who are able-bodied and choose to motor and don't wish to be discommoded. And that's most unfair to do that. I think we also have a history in this country of locking up and locking away people that were different. And when you do that, you're not as familiar. Those people become more alien. So maybe as a society, it's newer for us to liaise, work with, know people with disabilities. But there's a huge variety of disability, and within disability is ability. And we need to have an environment where everybody's ability is nurtured and enabled. So within that, we have many people who have disabilities, but they're able to cycle. We have people who are temporarily disabled. An able-bodied person has a slip and fall, and they're temporarily disabled. We need to broaden out our understanding of diversity within disability, and within that, broaden out our understanding of mobility aids. For example, babies can't walk. They need the mobility aid of a pram. We don't tend to think of someone pushing a pram as using a mobility aid, but that's exactly what it is. That's what makes that baby mobile. So having an infrastructure that enables the diversity of people and the mobility aids, it enhances everybody's life. If we build safe cycling infrastructure that allows someone with a disability to maybe cycle, it could be a tricycle rather than a bicycle, it could be an e-bike like mine. It also enables people who use motor scooters for disability a safe place in which they can move about, and that enables autonomy, and that's better for people's health, both physical and psychological health. And we also need to start connecting dots so that people, able-bodied or disabled, can connect their bike to a bus or a Lewis or a Dart. And in that respect, I think the Phoenix Park could use not just a through bus route for people who are commuting, but perhaps a loop mode of transport that, if it connected with Houston Station, that would connect Irish Rail with the Dart and the Lewis. And if that then connected with the different areas of interest within the park, that would cut down on the distance that people with mobility needs, would cut down on the distance that they needed to negotiate and open up at the park to them, and disconnect the idea that every disability has to be catered to through the use of a motor vehicle. And that's just not so.
Thanks very much for that, Mary. That's very insightful. I'm going to come to Councillor Pamela Conroy now in a second, but I just want to make a comment on just management of time here. We're coming up on 9 o'clock. I had hoped to try and keep the meeting to an hour, but I haven't done that, so sorry. But you know, it's been really useful, I think, what's happened so far. And there are panelists who might have to leave. They're under time constraints, so you know, feel free to leave if you have to. And apologies that we've gone over time. But anyone who's free to keep going, we might just keep chatting for another 20 minutes or so. And the meeting is being recorded, so we'll post it online later in the week, and anyone who misses out on the last few minutes can watch it back afterwards. So on that, I'll just come to Councillor Pamela Conroy now, please.
Hi, sorry, hi. Yeah, I'd just like to reiterate some of what Mary has said there. I have a son who's a wheelchair user, and at the moment, for me, the easiest way to get to the park with him, for him to enjoy the park in the same way that his siblings do, is to take my car to the park. And I would love if there was some way for us to travel to the park on public transport. As well as that, what Mary was saying about people who are temporary, who temporarily have mobility issues. I had seen somebody say over the period where the gates were suddenly opened up again, but the cycle lanes in the parking spaces in Chesterfield Avenue were left in place, being critical of that, because along Chesterfield Avenue is one of the main places where you can find a bench in the park along the footpath. And for those who have mobility issues, sometimes they need to sit down and have a rest. So I some benches along a different pathway near some accessible parking, and or if we ever get to it where transport stops. And there are alternatives, and I think it would be good if we could think outside the box in terms of dealing with some of the problems that have been flagged. I'd also like to say, just because I happen to be councillor for Castleknock, so an awful lot of people who live in this area were quite put out by the fact that they couldn't use the park as a through road, and I had a few representations of that nature, but I also had quite a large number of people contacting me who were in favour of having the gates closed as well. So I think because Jack Chambers is in the same constituency, I get the feeling that perhaps not everybody was represented accurately in this area, because quite a lot of people were in favour of allowing or limiting the car access to the park. Anyway, like I said, I just want to really thank Mary for raising her points. They're very valid, and thank you.
Thanks very much, Pamela, for that. I might just bring in Feljin Jose here from the Dublin Commuter Coalition, just to talk maybe a little bit more, Feljin, about public transport and the potential for improving the connectivity of the Phoenix Park and public transport.
Hey, so I think most people can agree that there's definitely a need to provide public transport service for access to different parts of the park. I mean, access to the gates, particularly the Park Gate Street entrance, is probably very good right now. I certainly think so, but that's not really good enough for a lot of people. Like, it's good enough for me, who's happy enough to walk around the park for 3 hours, but it's not good enough if you want to access the Ars and Upstron or the Visitor Centre and lots of other places. So we do need a bus route through the park. There's no real reason why we can't have it. I know, yeah, the bylaws do specifically exclude omnibuses and shower banks and all that, but I think there was a bus route through the park at some point. I don't know how much attention people pay to the bylaws, because it specifically mentions that goods vehicles are also not allowed to, well, sorry, it mentions that only cars or vehicles that are for the convenience passengers are allowed to use it. So I don't think it's that widely enforced. But like, the only reason the bylaws aren't changed or weren't changed was just lack of appetite from the OPW and the relevant minister, was it the Minister of Finance or Public Expenditure, whoever it is, it was over the years. So I think everyone can agree that we need the bus route. We should be calling for this during the public consultation. That will be coming up soon in the next couple of months. It should be very easy to implement. Nobody's shouted loud enough for it so far, really. I think a lot of people do agree with it, but they just haven't. It was never really a big issue for anyone. The Phoenix Park was never. I know a lot of people. It's very dear to a lot of people, but it didn't come to the national attention like it did over the last couple of months ever, I think. So now would be the perfect time to call for a bus route through the Phoenix Park. But whether it's buses or car access through even just general car access, I think we need to do traffic calming, because this Chesterfield Avenue right now is just geared for speeding, and there are a lot of narrow roads around the Phoenix Park, not just Chesterfield Avenue. A lot of bends where people who deliberately speed. So traffic calming is like, we need that. Chicanes, they're very imaginative ways you could do that within a park, especially with trees and plants, and it does not have to be bollard. It doesn't have to look ugly. There are loads of ways to do that. And someone mentioned, I think it was Kat who mentioned 30-kilometre-hour speed limits. There's no reason to have 50-kilometre-hour speed limits in the park. I cannot, even if it's buses or cars, I don't see it. But again, Kat mentioned that the Dublin City Council consultation to reduce speed limits from 50 kilometres per hour to 30 is by default in Dublin City. If that happens, the deadline is on the 13th. If that goes ahead, then it's becoming even more difficult to justify 50 kilometres per hour by default in the Phoenix Park, when the city itself is 30 kilometres per hour. So that's another thing. I think a lot of people would agree, at least here, would agree that 30 kilometres per hour should be the default in the park. But we should call for that, and if the city changes to 30 kilometres per hour, that's even more hard to justify now. I think we could look at average speed cameras as well. Speed cameras at a particular location is not much use if everyone knows where it is, particularly in a place like Phoenix Park. It would be easy enough to do on Chesterfield Avenue, I think, but ideally personally, or I think Dublin Commuter Coalition wouldn't want through access or through traffic through the Chesterfield Avenue anyway. So I don't know, if we do have it, I think we should definitely have average speed cameras. Some people mentioned Lewis through the park. I've heard two sort of versions of that. One was a spur off the red line, and another was a second line going to Manchester through the park. A spur off the red line is not feasible. I don't know. I can't see how that's feasible. If you split the branch from say around Houston or Park Gate Street, Benburb Street, you're effectively halving the capacity of the line going to Tala, and a lot of people would not thank you for that. So if we do build a Lewis through the park, it would likely have to be a separate line. I can't see how you could run more or keep the same capacity on the Tala branch and have twice as many Lewis going through Abbey Street and that sort of corridor, because it's not just about giving Lewis priority over cars in the city centre. It eventually runs into the other Lewis line on O'Connell Street, where there's just not enough capacity for that many trams if you build a spur off the red line. So if you're talking about a different line, then maybe, but I think a bus is so easy to implement, like in a matter of weeks, that we should really be calling for right now. Another thing with the Lewis line, you could run into problems with overhead lines, and I can imagine that would be widely opposed, but that's just another thing to think of. But yeah.
Thanks for that, Feljin. I mean, yeah, there's obviously a number of options, and we haven't explored half of them. So that really has to be a top priority for the sustainable transport model. Just in case we forget about cycling, I might just come to our chairperson, Kevin Baker, here, so that the big cycling lobby can get a word in on the Phoenix Park, and maybe just talk for a second about cycling experience during lockdown and what's happening at the moment, please.
Yeah, more than happy to. Excuse me, sorry. I always find it funny when we're called the big cycling or a cycling lobby, because Dublin Cycling is a charity, and one of the things we always talk about is we're not advocating for those who cycle right now. We're advocating so that all the people who would like to cycle could. And I think that's kind of what we saw in the Phoenix Park during the lockdown, was huge numbers of families and people who didn't normally cycle out on their bikes, enjoying the benefits of it and exploring the park. And one of the big reasons for that was not that the gates were closed, but that the amount of traffic on all of the side roads was very low, and the traffic speeds on the side roads were quite low. And to some extent, the gates open or closed to some extent is the wrong discussion on options. What we are trying to achieve is a people-friendly park. And one of the ways you make a park people-friendly for those who are some is to make the amount of traffic on the side roads low and the speed of traffic low. And you can do that in multiple different ways. I think one of the things that we saw in the park over lockdown was just the diversity of people cycling. And that is one of the things as a charity we are pushing for. There are huge benefits to cycling as a whole society, from benefits to people's personal health, to activity, to just exploring nature and having a better understanding for our city. And we don't get the big benefits that we could with the current situation. And so I think that's one of the reasons why we're all here tonight, is about building this broad coalition of people who want to see a change in the park, who know that after this lockdown, there is a different way of doing things. And like maybe not all the gates closed like it was. I'm sure we can find a better option that suits more people. But the benefits that that delivered was huge for people cycling, and particularly for new people cycling, smaller kids, older people, people you don't traditionally see on bikes. Thanks, Ciarán.
Thanks, Kevin. Mike Banim, you're representing Leafybatter, which is an organisation in Stoneybatter. We haven't got a huge number of those type of residential groups represented here this evening. We have a lot of their local councillors here, but you might speak for a second just as a kind of a local residential group or group with a focus on the environment in their local area, about your group's experiences living near to the Phoenix Park and traveling in and out of it.
Sure, yeah. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't really have that much to add. I feel everyone has really covered it quite well. The park definitely was. I mean, it was a real refuge for us. I'd say most of us in the group don't have any gardens whatsoever. We've got people living in apartments down in Blackwell Place. I'm up here in Curran Street Cottages. Now I'm fortunate that I have the Grange Gorman campus as well, which is also a great resource. But particularly people over further west in Stoneybatter, the park would be very important to them. So yeah, I mean, it was a fantastic resource. For me, I cycled out there quite a bit during lockdown. There's others in our group who wouldn't cycle and they were walking out there. So yeah, we loved it, and it was just hugely disappointing when it was just unilaterally kind of swung open again. I don't really have much to add, but I think everyone has made the points quite well. The only thing I mentioned that I was surprised I haven't heard mentioned is I haven't seen it this year, but I mean, I go out to Blanchardstown quite a lot because I have family out there, and previous years, Chesterfield Avenue would be closed through traffic all the time. And I don't know, because, you know, I drive, relatives who drive, that would impact our travel choices, and we wouldn't go through the park a lot of the time because we just assumed that the Chesterfield Avenue would be closed. So I think it kind of shows that there are alternative options, and, you know, we're not asking for something that's completely unprecedented here. So yeah, that's my perspective anyway.
Thanks very much, Mike. And I should have said at the start, but I forgot, was that this panel that we've assembled here isn't, it's not an exclusive group. It's not a definitive list of the people who are in favour of reducing traffic in the park, but it's what we could assemble in the few days that we're putting this meeting together. But what we're hoping to do is grow this into a larger representative group, so that, you know, I know there are people in who are attending the meeting who aren't on the panel, who are from residential groups or local area groups, and, you know, we'd call on them to, especially if your local representative is here on the panel, or if they're not, to get in touch with them, or you can get in touch with us directly via Dublin Cycling Campaign if you wish. But we really are welcoming all people on board on this. We think there should be enough people in favour of a sustainable park to make that happen. So yeah, just to get that message across, that this is by no means an exclusive group. We welcome everyone to get involved. And on that note, I might just get to the final part of the meeting, which is going to be a discussion on the next steps that we can take. I've kind of set out three main options here, which is the public consultation, which we've been told will start soon. Another route then is a public or political campaign, and then another option is to take direct action or to hold some kind of a protest. None of those, I suppose, are mutually exclusive. All of them can be done, but I guess it's figuring out what people's preferences are for those particular actions. And I might just prompt a little bit of a discussion on the public consultation, because we've heard throughout the meeting that there was a petition which Michael Pidgeon set up, which had over 7,500 responses to it. We've seen from Ken Foxe an insight into the decision that was made. It seems somewhat unilaterally by the Minister of State, Patrick O'Donovan, and that the OPW, the Gardaí and Dublin City Council were not opposed to keeping the perimeter gates closed. So to what extent can we put our faith or our hope in a public consultation if the Minister has already disregarded a wealth of input from local people and our wealth of insight from the experts in various representative bodies? Would anybody care to speak to that point? Michael, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, just really to say that, like, I would do all of those things that you've got on your list, but on the consultation, I don't think it's going to be one of those things where it's just asking the public what they want. My understanding is that they're going to come up with options, and there'll be some degree of consultation, but it'll mainly be an interagency discussion between the council, Department of Transport, and the OPW. So there's one thing to my mind is that process will have to come up with something, and it's virtually impossible to add more cars into the park than now. So I think we'll definitely get something out of that. I guess it's just a question of what people think the quickest and most impactful wins are. Are they side gate closures? Are they use of bollards? Is it the through traffic? I guess it'd be interesting, but I wouldn't put all your eggs in that one basket of the consultation or the process that's going ahead. But I wouldn't totally dismiss it either, because it was hard won internally in government, and I'm hopeful it'll come out with something. It's very unlikely that a process like that will just come out and say, let's keep things as they are. Something will come out of it.
Thanks, Michael. Senator Marie Sherlock, you want to go with that?
Yeah, thanks. Look, I agree with a lot of what Michael said there, and so I suppose any consultation is as good as the engagement it gets. So it's I suppose about people being very strategic, like as in accepting what Michael said, that there'll be options set out, but I think it's up to people as well to get organised and actually set out a vision for what they want, because you don't just have to answer the question on the exam paper. It's actually feeding back, and I suppose that there's, if we break it down into 2 if not 3 areas, there's the access into the park, there's the experience within the park itself, well, I suppose that, they're the 2 main. I think the other thing just to say is, and just on the issue of buses that was raised a number of I suppose repeatedly by a number of contributors this evening. I think the one thing just to be very mindful on that is that the Navan Road in particular, and I know there's a person here from the Navan Road Community Council, or certainly from the Navan Road, who's watching in on this tonight, that there would be quite a degree of resistance to the idea of the Dublin bus going through the Phoenix Park, because of the fear of displacing a bus, the bus service off the Navan Road. So again, it goes back to my earlier comment about building trust amongst local communities, interested users, and those who are coming from right across Dublin to enjoy the park. That we have to be mindful of all those various ideas, just particularly with regards to the bus. The last thing I just want to say is that the experience last year with regards to the OPW's concept of consultation would not give me great hope of what this current consultation is going to be like, because those who were part of that consultation last year will remember that you couldn't even actually physically access the document. You had to go into the visitor centre to access the document. So that's how archaic the experience last year was with regard to the consultation on the visitor experience for the Phoenix Park. I very much and sincerely hope that the experience of the consultation will be a much more open and inclusive and engaging experience.
Thanks, Marie. Was there someone else who wanted to come in there? Kevin, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I think there's been some fantastic points raised here. I'm always a little bit wary that sometimes public consultations can be a box checking exercise, and sometimes they are and sometimes they aren't, and it's hard to tell from the outside. But the thing that I've always found with public consultations where they get the best results is when the largest number of affected people involve themselves in the conversation. And this can't, I think Ciarán Perry kind of made this point very well earlier, and so did Marie Sherlock, about this idea of 2 opposing sides doesn't win anything. We need to build a broad coalition, invite many people to have a conversation where we try and convince each other of ideas, share our thoughts, listen to each other, take feedback, And we're only going to do that, not at the public consultation phase to some extent, where we get our ideas and we submit them to the government, but by having those conversations as community groups beforehand and to try and convince each other. Because to some extent, if we can build consensus before the public consultation, we will be much better enabling OPW to make a decision that we suspect they probably want to make. They are, to some extent, as we could see from their press releases beforehand, were very much interested in this huge public investment that was being shown in the park before the gates were reordered open. They were interested in seeing this experiment continue. And I think they were very much enthused by the fact that 7,500 people signed a petition and that use in the park seemed to go through the roof. So the more we can have that conversation before the public consultation, the better. The more people we will get involved when the 4-week public consultation does arrive.
Thanks, Kevin. Does anyone else want to say anything before I go to Louise Williams there? So Louise, you've been keeping an eye on the chat room there and some of the Q&A questions. What's coming up there, please?
Yeah, thanks, Ciarán. So actually a lot of the questions have kind of been answered along the way. The speed limit came up and that's brilliant that we got that answer. And I think it's also really brilliant to have this opportunity, as Kevin was saying, to kind of identify some of the key points that where we do quite easily find, you know, common ground on. For example, you know, having a recommendation to lower the speed limit, which seems quite sensible. There were also quite a few questions about cyclists, about people cycling in the park, and some of the there's some, you know, some of the conditions are not great, and there's some complaints about mammals, which we get everywhere in Dublin. And just the thing about the idea of a mammal, you know, a man in lycra going really fast on a racing bike, is that it then makes it more difficult for other people who don't want to go fast. So I think that really has it's highlighted across Dublin generally, but it's also highlighted in this discussion. And I think there were a lot of questions also raised that we actually haven't answered, but I think it's one for all of us to kind of bear in mind around accessibility, you know, getting into the park. And Mary spoke so eloquently about kind of the experience in the park, but also about kind of gates, you know, are gates actually wheelchair friendly? And as Mary pointed out, you know, are they pushchair friendly? So that's another aspect I think that we really need to think about. And these are all aspects that have always been there, but given the pandemic and given our experience in Dublin, it's sort of highlighting this inequality and this very poor design of some of the public services that we're now witnessing. So that was the sort of the bulk of it. I think maybe there's one, if I can put one quick question, Ciarán. It's how to police the illegal parking and the sort of arbitrary parking that's going on. That's one that I think I'm not clear on as yet, but I think that's one that I think might be worth kind of teasing out, because that is a massive issue and it's affecting an awful lot of people who just want to walk around the park. I don't know if anybody would have an answer to that.
I'll make one quick comment on it, is that I like to refer to it as antisocial parking, that it's antisocial behaviour. It is illegal, but it's also extremely antisocial. And the gate closure, it seemed to move the antisocial parking from inside the park to just outside the park. And then when the gates reopened, it just put the problem back inside the park again. But as was mentioned earlier, enforcement isn't evident either side of the gates. Kat, O'Driscoll, go ahead.
Yeah, this is also an issue we're struggling with a lot in Cabra in particular, in residential areas. Illegal parking, it is illegal, it's also antisocial. The only success we've seen is really regular checks by parking enforcement, but what we need to look at it's not trying to remove the cars, it's trying to change a behaviour. And if we do see it as a changing behaviour, we're actually probably going to be more successful with information campaigns and changing people's minds, showing them how wide a space a pram or a wheelchair needs, and things like that. Hopefully that's something that will help along with enforcement and in partnership with enforcement. But I'm really seeing it as a behaviour change. We need to look at it as.
Go ahead, Marie.
Sorry, just on the parking, and it's not really a road for ourselves, but for the OPW, but for those of us who are tweeting or, you know, posting about the parking, the illegal parking in the park, I think it's really important to get across the message. There's 1,200 car parking spaces in the park. And as somebody who has driven up and sees the car park and says, oh no, gosh, it's full, there's usually 1 or 2 spaces. And anybody who's a J follower here and knows Clonus or Thurles or Killarney and Match Day, you see the cars up ahead, you think, oh my God, there's no space, and you drop the car. And that's what people are doing, because there's almost a hysteria now that there isn't car parking, there isn't space to park the car in the Phoenix Park, and there is. So I think to those of us who are tweeting our annoyance about illegal parking, it's just worth making the point. There's 1,200 parking spaces. If people drive up, they will get parking by and large, even at the busiest times of the day. But there's a mentality out there, and Kat is exactly right. It's about changing behaviour, but there is a mentality out there that, and in some ways, dare I say it, it has probably been inflamed by some of our comments about, people are dropping the cars and look what's happened now that you've left the cars back into the park. Again, we have to, I would argue, have to think about, a peaceful coexistence here, albeit trying to reduce the cars in the park, or that's our mission ultimately, but that there is pit parking, and to reassure people that there is parking, and they don't have to drop the car at the side of the road.
Thanks, Marie. We're getting close to the end here now, but I've shared the results of the poll which we started earlier, which was just well, the first 2 questions were unanimous almost. And then in terms of what action people thought would be most effective, 52% said engage with the public consultation, 30% said launch a campaign, a publicity campaign or a political campaign. Only around 15% were looking for direct action or protest. Just on that note, we have a representative from the Streets Are for People group here with us, who's Cian McKenna. Cian, your group, if you want to tell us a little bit about them, engaged in some direct action on St. William Street and Liffey Street last year, just trying to make a point around space for people. You might say if there's the potential for something like that in the Phoenix Park as well.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes, so Streets for People, it's quite a good few people here actually were involved in it last summer. So after being sick of there was sort of a suggestion that St. William Street might be pedestrianised 8 or 10 years ago or something like that, and it was sort of kicked around for years. So on a Saturday morning last summer, a bunch of us decided to just take things into our own hands really, and open up St. William Street to pedestrians and cyclists and divert the car traffic out of Brown Thomas car park around the other way. And we were really scared at the time, but it turned out to be a great success. The guards came along pretty much immediately, but because we weren't causing any trouble, they let it go on for the whole day, and it just gave people a glimpse of what that street could be like, and did it again a few months ago at Liffey Street, just to give people a taste of what that might be like. And now we can see this summer Dublin City Council have gone ahead and trialled pedestrianisation in those areas. And I think the lockdown gave people an opportunity to see what Phoenix Park is like. So in a way, it doesn't need to be shown to people like we needed to show it to them last summer, because I think these sort of ideas can kind of scare people, and like that they go, oh, where's the traffic going to go at the end of the day? In terms of the Phoenix Park, I suppose it's much more difficult to make a show of it. It's quite dramatic when you with 20 people or so you could do what we did on St. William Street, but the Phoenix Park is huge and there's many gates to cover. And you need a lot more bodies and probably be in communication with walkie-talkies or something like that if you did decide to put yourself in front of the gates. So I think it would be a completely different animal when it comes to putting on direct action. But it just goes to show that sometimes you really have to put yourself out of your comfort zone. But it pays off. And the Gardaí, if you're not causing serious trouble, they will they're not going to throw you into a riot van. So yeah.
Thanks, Cian. So we've just gone over 90 minutes, and I think everyone's kind of reaching the end of their mental capacity. So we might just start to wind up, unless anyone has anything pressing to say. Otherwise, I just want to thank all of our panelists for participating, and it's been a really insightful discussion. I think it's been a fruitful discussion. We don't have any definitive next steps, but we've really got a consensus on a lot of the pressing issues here. So just to reiterate again that this is about building coalitions and building relationships. It's not exclusive, it's not definitive, and we'd encourage everyone to get in touch with us, get involved, get in touch with your local reps or your local residents group, whatever way you can. Just start to get involved in this issue, and we'll maybe put our heads together again in the next few days and see what definitive next steps we can take. We're not going to be able to decide anything at this stage. So if no one has anything else specific to say, I might finish the meeting here.
Ciarán, can you do one thing? Just give an email address to the chat. There's lots of people in the chat are looking to get involved, and they're trying to figure out who should they email.
Okay, just to get the Dublin Cycling Campaign email address, it's info@dublincycling.com, or if it's one of your local representatives you're looking to get in touch with, you can find that on whoismytd.com is a good website for finding out who your local representatives are. So that's it. Thanks to everybody, and we'll finish it here, and have a good evening. Bye bye.
Thanks for organising.
Thank you,
Ciarán. Thanks.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Following up.
Okay.